All right, everyone. I hope you can hear me and you're getting all of this. So I wanted to just quickly go over the syllabus and then finish up chapter 3 and so on. So anyway, so first couple of things. The first maybe important thing to know, reminder that by September 11th, the second chapter 2 quiz is due, and so that's on Canvas, so you'll find that in the quizzes under Canvas. And then yesterday you had the hate packback posts. Today we'll finish up chapter 3. Next week we go on to chapter 4, social cognition. I'll also have an important lecture on politics and social psychology that you'll definitely want to watch for the exam and just for the rest of the class and so on. Again, by Tuesday you'll have another the chapter 3 of the hate reading due, and then the chapter 3 quiz will be due then next week. And then importantly on September 24th, I believe, is that correct? Yes, you will have the first exam on that Saturday. I don't know why, actually that should be the Friday, I'll change that. You will have the application module quiz due, and I'll explain that next week as well, and then we get into emotions and a lot of fun stuff. So anyway, I just wanted to go over that and make sure that you saw all of that. So today, going back to where we left off. Okay, just wanted to make sure that something's recording. Okay, talking about culture. One of the things that researchers have found is this system, this culture of honor in the American South. And to kind of quote out of this book, Culture of Honor, common law and lynch law were ethically compatible. The first enabled the legal profession to present traditional order. The second conferred upon ordinary white men the prerogative of ensuring that community values of white supremacy held ultimate sovereignty. So we know from survey data that a couple of things we find. We find that U.S. Southerners are more likely to commit homicide in situations where there has been an insult, and Southerners are more likely to believe that violence is an appropriate response to an insult. So U.S. Southerners are not necessarily more violent or more likely to commit homicides than other parts of the country, but they're more likely to do in situations where there's been an insult. And you can see sort of different related murders looking at the South and the Southwest. Cities of 200,000 or more, felony related, so like robberies, stuff like that. You see quite a few. I forget how they're measuring it, suicide rates per 100,000. But argument-related murders is really high for cities of 200,000 or more. Okay, so you think maybe that's just a big city thing. If you look at cities less than 200,000, you still sort of see the same relationship, maybe a little bit less for the South in general, but still argument-related murders far outpace felony-related murder. So that's kind of interesting. What's going on there? As I said, we know this from survey data and crime data, but what about psychological? What's the social psychology going on here? So one of the most fascinating studies that was done by one of the authors of your book, who I mentioned last time, Richard Nisbet. And they did this study at the University of Michigan, and I believe, pretty sure everyone they were all male, they were all white, they were all middle class, basically relatively similar, except one crucial difference. Some of them were Northerners, and some of them were Southerners, from New England, some from the Deep South. And so they thought they were doing a study on the effects of time constraints on judgments of various kinds, so they had to fill out this questionnaire, and then the real experiment began. So they had to take this questionnaire down this long, narrow hallway, kind of like this, where it's lined up with filing cabinets, and then they have to leave it on a table at the end of the hallway. Now, for some students, there was a student Confederate. We mean by that, not Southern Confederate, meaning a student who's pretending to be just some random person, but who's actually part of the experiment. And so there's a student Confederate who's opening one of these file cabinets, and for the actual participant to pass by, they have to get close to the drawer and basically give the student some space. And then on the way back, the student, Confederate who's standing there says, "Watch it, asshole." And then they go into a room and lock the door. And so, okay, that's basically, participants are then basically assigned to one condition or the other. The one is whether they were called an asshole, and then the other is whether they were not. So basically one being insulted and one being not. Various groups of various Southerners and Northerners in both conditions. And so they have to fill in this questionnaire, then they have to come back, and right when they get back, they measure their blood pressure, take blood samples and other things like that. Other things that they do. So they had people observing somewhere else in the hallway, excuse me, the reaction to being insulted. And they found that some Southerners showed a flash of anger, whereas Northerners didn't. But maybe that was just a biased perception of the researchers. So as I said, they, measured their cortisol rates and a bunch of other stuff, which I'll talk about in a moment. So then they had another part. So right after, they have this encounter, they have to read this story in which this man makes a pass at another man's fiancée, and then they're asked to provide an ending for the story. So, there's the story, this guy, says, "Oh, you're beautiful, let's go out tonight," right in front of the guy's fiancée, and then so the participant has to come up with an ending for the story after they've either been insulted or not. And so what they found was that insulted Southerners were more likely to provide a violent ending to the story than Southerners who had not been insulted, whereas the endings provided by Northerners were unaffected by whether or not they had been insulted. So that's pretty interesting. As I said, there's some interesting biochemistry going on too. So they looked at cortisol, and I'll actually talk about cortisol next week, and that's for the first application module. Cortisol is basically the chemical that's released during your fight or flight response. And so you see here the control condition where they're not insulted, the insulted condition, you got the northern subjects and the southern subjects. So interestingly, after being insulted, their fight or flight cortisol actually goes down, whereas for southern subjects, as you can see, it goes way up. Huge jump there. Maybe it's not a fight or flight deal for the northern subjects, maybe they're from New York and they're in Michigan, and someone calls them an asshole, and they're like, "Oh, this feels like home," as New York is notorious for, being hard-edged and whatnot. Okay, looking at testosterone levels, you actually do get then, a little bit of a increase for northern subjects after being insulted, but again, a huge increase for southern subjects. Note again that they start out from basically, similar places, but, whether they're insulted or not, and whether they're from the north or south, plays a big plays a big role. So why is this? What's going on here? What's the one last aspect of it. So when they had the participant then walk down the hallway, presumably ending the study, although it was still going on, they had another Confederate, another person pretending to be just some random student, a big, muscular, tall assistant to the experimenter comes walking towards the student, and then the dependent variable is how far the participant was before finally swerving out of the way. And they found that Northerners swerved at a distance of about 5 feet, while Southerners did it at about 9 feet. That's generally Southern hospitality, that sort of thing, if they had not been insulted, and that's the key. If they had been insulted, however, the Southerners, they basically played a game of chicken and didn't move until 3 feet. So they go from 9 feet if they're not insulted to 3 feet if they are insulted. No change really for the Northerners. Really kind of a fascinating set of experiments there, showing culture of honor. Okay, well, what's going on here? Why does the South, and again here talking about the white Southerners, why do white Southerners have this culture of honor? Where does this come from? Well, it comes from the settlers, the people who settled, the white settlers in the South. They were pastoralists, and there's not a lot of pastoralists left in the world. I did a lot of research on conflict here in East Africa and Sudan and Chad, and looking at pastoral groups, among others, and I'll actually talk about that later. Pastoralists are people who herd cattle, and they're nomadic. They follow the weather. Essentially, it is a hard way of life. Requires a lot of strength, a lot of physical strength, and so you see throughout history, a lot of pastoral groups have been warrior cultures, and there's been strong cultures of honor there. And so in the South, at least initially, some of the initial Southern settlers, white Southern settlers, were from Scotland, from the Scottish Highlands, where you had a strong culture of honor there, as opposed to parts of New England, where you had people coming from parts of southern England, London, France, and Germany. Anyway, kind of a fascinating set of stuff there. Okay, looking at the social self again, and sort of the independent self and the interdependent self, actually, is what I'm looking at. Excuse me, just looking to make sure my notes are in order. Okay, so the interdependent view of the self then is, kind of what we would see in a more collectivist society, where the self is seen as connected to others, and your sense of self is defined by your obligations, your shared traits, things like that. And this comes from the book. I think that's a good view. So the independent view of the self, that's you, and you see your mother and father may be connected to you, maybe your sibling is a little bit too as well. Not so much the coworker, you've got friends that are connected and so on. The interdependent view of the self, though, sees mother, father, sibling, everyone in your social relationships as being sort of part of the self. Now, okay, that's kind of an interesting way to think about it. Well, is there sort of any, physical evidence for this? Yes, there is, and it's quite interesting. So when people are asked to judge the self, to think about them, their individual self, it activates their medial prefrontal cortex. Remember, we talked about that before, and we will again. This is the frontal lobe. It's involved with self-knowledge and things like that. So this study got together a bunch of American and Chinese participants to rate the applicability of different traits to themselves, to their mothers, and to some other unrelated person. And they did MRIs and neuroimaging and stuff like that. And came up with some really fascinating results. For members of both cultures, you had basically, when you're thinking about the self, you have the prefrontal cortex activated and so on. But for Chinese participants, the activation in the same region was observed when participants were thinking about themselves as well as whether the traits characterized their mothers. So, the mother is actually seen as, or at least the traits of the mother are seen similarly as the traits one views in themselves. For Westerners, Americans, you actually saw a deactivation in the medial prefrontal cortex when thinking of the mother. So really kind of fascinating there. This comes from the textbook. American and Japanese participants were shown these different cartoons where you had this, white boy for the American or an Asian boy for the Japanese in the center, and they were surrounded by 4 other people who are also in all of the same pictures. So in some of the cartoons, the emotional expression of the boys in the front match those of those in the back, and in some, as in those pictured here, they didn't. So you have them smiling here and frowning in the background, smiling in the background but frowning here. So then they were asked then to basically kind of describe the emotional expression of the boy in the front. Now, when the Japanese were asked to do it, they were actually more likely to take into account the feelings of the rest of the crowd. So they might say the boy is smiling because maybe he's trying to cheer people up even though there's something sad going on, or something like that. Whereas, the Americans might say, well, he's smiling because he won and everyone else is sad because they lost, or something along those lines. So anyway, kind of interesting study there. Another kind of fascinating study along these lines. Here, looking at how people sort of define themselves, whether they define themselves more in terms of personal characteristics, like I've got a really cool haircut and I'm really smart and, I'm a skateboarder, whatever, or as roles and group memberships, like, I'm part of a club, I'm part of a team, and I'm a part of a political party, whatever it might be, part of a religion, that sort of thing. And so this study was done, they looked at American undergraduates, and as you can see here, most American undergraduates define themselves in terms of personal characteristics, very few in terms of their roles and group memberships. You look at Kenyan undergraduates, so Kenyans, people in Kenya who are going to college, pretty similar to what you see in America. People are define themselves primarily based upon their personal characteristics. Big change, though, when you look at workers in Nairobi. So these are people working in Kenya, but not, going through the higher education system, which is kind of currently has a Western model. You see that they define themselves more in terms of roles, in terms of group memberships, maybe like their neighborhood, the job that they're in, their clan. And then you see huge differences in terms of tribes people, the Maasai and the Samburu, which are, tribal societies in Kenya. They define themselves almost completely in terms of roles and group memberships, because when you're in a tribe, it's you have a very important role, because if you don't do the role of the tribe in your tribe, then the tribe doesn't work and you get banished or reprimanded or killed or whatever. So again, just kind of fascinating differences and interdependent views versus more individualistic views. What about gender in the social self? Well, as I say here, be sure to read also the stuff about social class. I'm not going to go into it in the lecture, but really fascinating stuff there about social class and social perceptions relevant to some of you in college. Okay, gender. We find that women tend to have a more interdependent sense of self than men. Kind of interesting. So, we've talked about politics a bit. We'll talk about it much more. Libertarians, this is the philosophy based upon individual rights, the sort of, the ultimate philosophy, political philosophy of individualism. Interestingly, libertarians in the United States range from about 70 to 80% being men. That doesn't mean you don't have people like Ayn Rand, a famous female libertarian, and others, and you have more, the percentage of women libertarians is growing, but generally, overwhelmingly, a male political ideology and philosophy. Also, I believe that's the political philosophy that has the least to say about child rearing and family, which, we can speculate on that, talk about that more later and so on. So anyway, the idea here being that women are more likely to, because they biologically have children and historically, culturally have done most of the child rearing, the idea being here that you might have that women are more interdependent because they're more have to think more about the community itself, relations and things like that. Also, evolution definitely played a role in contributing to some of these gender differences. We'll get into this in more detail when we talk about attraction, physical attraction, and sexual behavior and things like that. But just kind of the basic difference here, independent views of self in terms of men may have come about from physical competition and hunting, whereas interdependent views of the self may have given women an advantage in maintaining social bonds, community, and things like that. Okay, other things, social comparison theory. So this is the hypothesis that basically people compare themselves to others to obtain, better ideas about themselves. And, research has more or less found that to be true. So the psychologist Leon Festinger has argued that you need to compare yourself with people who are roughly at the same skill level as yours. So downward social comparisons may boost our self-esteem because, they make us feel better about ourselves. But, they may not actually make us perform better. If we actually want to work on self-improvement, we want to do upward social comparisons, but not too high. So if we get like a B in algebra in some algebra exam or something like that, and, you're not going to help yourself too much by comparing yourself to an A+, someone who got an A+. Someone who got a B+ or an A-, maybe you compare to them, and that might be better. One study of ninth graders at different schools found that a lot of them chose, when they could compare grades, chose to compare grades with someone who did slightly better than they did, so that they could learn a little bit from them. Relative deprivation plays into this. Sometimes there's the idea that, you don't feel deprived until you see someone else has something better than you. You're satisfied with your iPhone until you see someone with a new iPhone, and all of a sudden you feel completely deprived and you can't go on with life until you get that new iPhone, and so on. That brings us to self-esteem, and I just think this is funny. Anyway, so we find that people with low self-esteem are less satisfied with life, more hopeless, more depressed, less able to cope with some of life's changes sometimes. They also tend to cluster together in social groups. So we find that looking at, say, adolescent depression rates for men and women, boys and girls, I should say, don't change too much for boys, go up a little bit from like 2010 to roughly today. Huge jump starting around 2010, 2011 to roughly 2016 when the study ends, and it's actually, I think, gone up. Huge jump in depression rates for girls. So what's going on? And self-esteem is obviously a big part of this. This was actually, I snapped a picture of this at a talk that Jonathan Haidt, who the author of Righteous Mind, gave. I just thought this chart was just stunning. So this is at hospital admissions for non-fatal self-harm by girls. So, like self-mutilation, like, cutting themselves and stuff like that, bruising themselves, stuff like that. So age 20 to 24, people roughly, your age, are 17% increase from 2009 to 2015. For 15 to 19-year-olds, so basically high schoolers, a 62% increase. So pretty big jump there. But here, this is really huge and really alarming. For girls 10 to 14, so basically, girls entering puberty, preteen years, and so on, 189% increase in hospital admissions. So huge increase. So what is going on there? Some of this is, I think, captured in the movie 8th Grade. So a big part of it, obviously, is social media. So, social media has become much more pervasive in our lives. But also there's something else too. So social media in various forms have been around for, since the early 2000s. Obviously not as pervasive as like Facebook and Snapchat and stuff today. But so why do we get this jump then in really starting 2011 and 2010 and stuff? Well, it has to do with the smartphone. The iPhone is invented in 2007, or at least comes onto the market. And so 2010, 2011, 2012, everybody has a smartphone. Everybody's got apps and Instagram and selfies and selfie culture and all of that. So people basically, there's been found that, people are happy for the first 10 or 15 minutes that they're on Facebook and get depressed after that. We'll return to more discussions about this later on, social media and stuff like that. Important things, self-esteem. So trait self-esteem, this is more or less your overall image that you have of yourself, whether positive or negative. Oh, I'm sorry, that's self-esteem. Trait self-esteem is basically your self-esteem across time. It kind of may go up or down based upon events in your life, but there's generally a core trait, that you have. Maybe it generally tends to be pretty good. It tends to be pretty high. State self-esteem then is the more dynamic, changing views, that happen as a result of things that happen in your life. Maybe you have low self-esteem the next couple of weeks because you didn't do so well on some exam, or you were dumped by your significant other or something like that, but then you find your true love and you go back to your happy, high self-esteem or whatever, do good on an exam, etc. So in the book, there's a classic study, classic scale, I should say, that you can just quickly see, how high your self-esteem is. Won't go over that in too much detail. Other aspects that play a role, contingencies of self-worth. So generally, how well you do in the areas in terms of what you deem your self-worth will have a huge effect on your self-esteem. So if your self-worth is based upon your performance in your computer science class, and you start not doing so well in that class, that's going to have a huge effect then on your self-esteem. So sociometer is this idea, I won't go into hierometer today, I'll save that for another day. Sociometer is the idea that basically your self-esteem is this kind of constant readout, is kind of like this constant data set that's being added to by your interactions with other people. Essentially, that self-esteem is essentially measured by your interactions and how other people look at you. Obviously, how you do for yourself, but again, a lot of that is related to other people. So when we look at independent cultures, Western cultures, we tend to see higher levels of self-esteem than in interdependent, more collectivist cultures. Fantastic documentary that I might throw in the modules for this chapter. Again, anything I throw in the modules, any videos aren't required. They're just there for your own interest. The Century of the Self, looking at Freud and Freudian psychoanalysis and how that was sort of used by science, but then also by advertising and consumerism, really developed the 20th century. We see some differences, interestingly, in a lot of Asian societies. A lot of Asian languages don't have an equivalent word for the idea of self-esteem. And the measurement of value and so on isn't so much on maybe your individual success excuse me, in interdependent cultures, but rather on your contribution to the society, your contribution to others, and so on. But we do know that cultural interactions can change people, and that's actually the history of human development and human society and so on. So Asians who have more contact with Western cultures will actually report higher levels of self-esteem than those that don't. So I thought this was a pretty fascinating study looking at self-esteem scores, looking at Japanese and Canadians, and they find that Japanese who have spent their whole lives in Japan score low on these scales of self-esteem. Those who have been abroad score a bit higher. Recent immigrants to Canada from Japan score higher. Then you see the trend here, and basically by the time you get to third generation Asian Canadians, it's essentially the same as European Canadians in terms of self-esteem. So very, very interesting there. Now, so the idea, though, in American society in particular, this is not a Western thing, certainly not in France. In American society, we have almost a cult of positivity, and we'll actually return to this in more detail later, but dozens of studies have now shown that people who say that they are more well-adjusted are actually more prone to illusions about themselves, which is kind of fascinating, rather than those who suffer from low self-esteem or depression. So they had high self-enhancers, people who basically, kind of follow Marcus Aurelius here, the famous Stoic emperor of Rome. The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. High self-enhancers. Low self-enhancers are those who may, more likely to be depressed and so on. And so what they found was that they had them do these tasks like counting backwards from like some random number like 9,915 or something. And low self-enhancers had higher levels of cortisol, that stress hormone, and less arousal of their autonomic nervous system in general, which is kind of interesting. So anyway, we'll talk about that actually more when we talk about cortisol next week. Interestingly here, better than average effect. A lot of people that find that they think that they're better than average. This tends to be also people in the West tend to score higher on this, tend to see themselves as being better than average. And so on. This is kind of self-explanatory there. Other things. So again, if self-affirmation theory, this is the idea that, if you say you think that you're a great skateboarder and you get a blow to your self-esteem in that area, you fail at it miserably, do badly in front of a bunch of other people, you compensate in another area by being a good surfer or something like that, and so on. So you want accurate information about yourself so you can assess your own behavior. So interestingly, people who have negative self-views remember negative feedback better. And that's often because you're responding, and we'll talk about this in much more detail next week when we talk about politics and so on. But we often will respond to negative images and negative feedback, negativity in general, a bit more. So as I said, this kind of just goes along with what I said a few moments ago. Ignorance is bliss. That's kind of true. That actually people who are well-adjusted actually have kind of unrealistic views about themselves and about the world. And so, which has been kind of interesting when we look at coronavirus and COVID and the various responses that people have had. And we'll talk about that in more detail later. So I'm not a depressed person, but I have a general sort of sense of melancholy that I balance out with a sense of optimism as well. But basically, I do not have this positive illusion about myself or the world. And so I've no illusions about COVID-19 or the damage that it could cause and will cause society. Shelley Taylor, I like this quote: "The idea that positive illusions are in the service of self-esteem virtually requires that they stay in check. If one develops substantially unrealistic expectations regarding the future that greatly exceed what one is actually able to accomplish, then one is set up for failure and disappointment, leading to lower self-esteem." So, you want to be realistic in your expectations, and I think some of that requires learning some sociology, learning about psychology, learning about history, economics, things like that, so you have an idea of what's going on at a broader social level. And you're not surprised if, say, your dream is to live in California and, go to the redwoods all the time and then go surfing all the time. That may not be realistic if you're paying attention to the climate data and so on and so forth. And if you can't surf and, can't find a job out there, that sort of thing. Anyway, so we're spending a lot of time talking about these automatic processes, and Haidt talks about that a lot, and he's really emphasizing that against the rationalist delusion and so on. So, but there are things, where we have to regulate, where we actually have to self-regulate, and we'll be talking about a number of experiments, really kind of fascinating things that are done, ego depletion, where we call them, where people have to do something that's sort of requires their mental energy. So in one study, they had participants who controlled behavior by eating healthy radishes instead of delicious cookies, and they found that those who had to control their behavior by eating the radishes actually... Wait a second. Oh yeah, those who had to control, those who had to eat healthy radishes gave up a puzzle later, gave up faster, gave up on a puzzle that they had to take later than those who ate cookies, because the radishes, it's not something people like as much, so they're kind of more mental effort is just going into thinking about eating the radish, whereas that's not the case for eating the cookies. Okay, some of you may be familiar with this kind of famous study, this classic marshmallow study. You have a preschooler left in a room. They have two options. They have this marshmallow in front of them that they can have right away. That's a small reward. They can eat it immediately. Or they can have two marshmallows if they wait 15 minutes. And so they do this, and they find, later on they find different, it varies. And they find that the kids who are more patient viewed the marshmallow as a cloud, or as cotton candy, or not cotton candy, as cotton rather than candy. So as like a cloud or cotton in their minds, so that it didn't, wasn't too enticing. those who didn't, just saw a marshmallow that they wanted to eat. Later studies then found big socioeconomic differences too, that poorer kids were more likely to eat the one marshmallow. And the reason there being that, well, they don't get, this goes to impulse control and poverty in general, they don't have this opportunity very often, and it's just like, oh my god, there's a marshmallow there, I want it so bad, I'll just eat it right now, who knows if I'll get a second one, if I'll actually even get a second one, that sort of thing. Anyway, so kind of a fascinating study there. Self-discrepancy theory, so you can read about some of the stuff there in the textbook. We often have our ideal selves and, these other types of selves, and we don't quite actually live up to these things. So different types of self. You have the actual self, the self that people believe they are. Then you have the ideal self, one that embodies your individual wishes and aspirations. And then the ought self, the self that is connected with duties, obligations, and other demands, and so on. All right, so I'm going to end it there, and I hope you have a good discussion today. Remember the quizzes and the readings for next time. And I look forward to the pack discussion.